I think people assume that voters we can't tell them about all of this. It's like, you have to pretend everything's okay. But of course, governments have been making choices, right? You read off that list of local government. They have chosen how much to cut out of the different local government budgets. Choices have been made. I reckon actually voters would quite like to know about these things and help make that choice about, do you want to prioritise adult and child social care, or transport budgets, or planning applications, or courts, or these are the kinds of things. And what does the state do that we should absolutely be talking about and making choices about? We can't do everything. What do we prioritise? So I think this idea that voters don't, we can't, but we pretend like it's not there. Like, well, it is there, and we will make choices, just not ones that have been well informed by voters knowing what they're voting for. That just seems not a good idea at all.
Hello and welcome to the IFS Zooms In. I'm Paul Johnson, Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, and here we are with another special election edition. And on Monday this week, we released our comprehensive analysis of the parties' manifestos at an event in Westminster. After some time digesting and analysing the manifestos, we've concluded that neither of the main parties is being terribly honest with us, with voters, about the challenges we face in the coming years. That perhaps won't come as a great surprise to regular listeners. So today we're going to talk a little bit about what the manifestos are missing, why we think we're not learning what we should be learning, and something about the challenges facing us. And we'll try and give you some sense of what we think should have been in the manifestos, not the policies that should have been there, but the sorts of options that should at least have been presented. So today I'll be speaking again to my colleagues who have been working on the analysis: Carl Emerson, Helen Miller and Christine Farquharson. In an even more special edition later this week, we'll be taking your questions about the election and trying to answer them. So please do put your comments and questions below, and we will try and get back to them in our next edition. So let's, there's lots and lots we could cover here, and listeners might like to know we spent about an hour and a half talking about this morning. We are not going to bombard you with an hour and a half worth of podcast. You can't see any of the lovely charts anyways, but we're going to cover a couple of the big issues. One of the things, let's start with this rather important, if rather dull-sounding topic of baselines. Why on earth am I talking about baselines? Well, the question here is the various manifestos talk about a certain amount of additional money for the NHS, additional money for schools or what have you, but they don't tell you additional to what. And that therein lies quite a big problem in understanding these manifestos. So, Christine, perhaps you could expand on this baseline problem and why the lack of a baseline makes so much of this so hard to follow.
Sure. I think you've now said the word baseline so many times it's done that thing where it's gone a little bit funny in my head. But but this is a genuine, serious problem, because this is fundamental to how we understand what's happening in the manifestos, what promises the parties have actually made. The big picture here is we had a budget a few months ago, back in March, feels like a lifetime. And at that budget, we heard about the plans for public service spending over the next few years, but we only heard about the total envelope. What we haven't had and what we don't know is how that envelope is going to be allocated across different areas of public services. So we know that overall day-to-day public service spending will grow by about 1% in real terms year on year for the next few years. But how that gets split across departments, we have no idea. There's no baseline that's priced in. And what that means for the parties is, number one, they're able to get away with saying, we're just going to sign up. 1% sounds about right. Maybe a little more for Labour, maybe a marginal fraction less for the Conservatives, but that seems plausible. And because that hasn't been allocated against specific public services, it's really difficult to judge, actually, is that right? Or indeed, if some public services take up a much larger fraction of the pie, that leaves less for other areas, and how plausible are those cuts going to be? So that's kind of problem number one. Problem number two with this lack of baseline is it makes it really hard to judge the actual commitments that the parties have made in their manifestos. So I'll give you an example. On the NHS, we don't have a baseline. We don't know what is set to happen to the overall core NHS budget, how that current round about £180 billion that we spend, how that's going to evolve. You could, for example, imagine that stays flat in real terms and we get to 2028 and we're still spending round about 100 billion, 180 billion in today's prices. You could imagine that rises by something like 3.6% a year, which is what you would need to do in order to implement the NHS workforce plan that both parties have signed up to. That would put your core spending somewhere north of £220 billion a year. So that's a huge range, £40 billion or thereabouts. And then set against that, we have the very specific, very detailed, nicely fully costed pledges that were set out in those manifesto costing sheets, which from both Labour and the Conservative Party amounted to maybe 1 or 2 billion here or there. So the differences that we're being encouraged to focus on between these manifestos are absolutely dwarfed by the scale of difference in how overall NHS spending could turn out, just because we don't know what that baseline actually is.
Yeah, and it is, Carl Everson sitting next to me wrote a great piece this morning in the Times and on the IFS website about the impossibility of making any sense, really, of these NHS pledges. As you say, £1 or £2 billion extra pledged for a bit of dentistry and a bit of some more diagnostic machines and so on, off a baseline today of 180 billion and an expected spend of somewhere in the region of 220 billion in 5 years' time. To have a manifesto which goes on about £1 billion or two on that just doesn't make any sense.
You can see what they're trying to do. They're saying that, look, we'll spend an extra £1 billion or £2 billion on these specific things, and we can show you how we can raise that money from some tax change or some spending change. And that's a very modest change to do that. And what they don't want to tell us is, oh, and by the way, when we say that we're committed to the workforce plan, that means we're going to spend an extra, say, £40 billion on the NHS. And therefore, we'd have to show you where that £40 billion was coming from. They don't want to show you where the big numbers would come from, because that would be really difficult to do. They're very happy to say, look, oh, there's £1 billion from this small change in spending here, or this tax rise that doesn't affect very many people here.
And it's our assumption, Christine, isn't it, that the 40 billion they will probably have to find, and that's why we think there's nothing really left for anything else.
I mean, that's a big part of it. So we have done our best with the information we have, which is pretty limited, to try and think about what that overall public service envelope might mean for specific areas of public services. Part of that is both Labour and the Conservatives have said, yes, we really want to implement this workforce plan. And so we've said, if you really want to implement it, you're probably going to have to find the money to do that. But even under those assumptions, you then you keep running into the same issue. You run into it when you look at schools, you run into it when you look at further education, you run into it when you look at colleges, justice, over and over and over again. We have these small commitments, and we have this big overarching question that neither of the parties has really given us a sense of, well, actually, you've set your finite budget constraint. How can you give us even an indication of how you would want to allocate that once you dig one level deeper?
And the answer is they really aren't, which is causing us a degree of frustration and does make any analysis of these manifestos really very hard. You've mentioned things like local government and prisons and courts in that. I mean, these are the sorts of things that don't get much coverage, with the parties all want to crack down on crime and all those sorts of things, but they haven't told us anything about whether they're going to give any more money to prisons or the court system. And you've been digging into this a little bit, Christine, and the numbers don't look very pretty, do they?
So if you rewind the clock and you look at what's happened over the last 15 years between 2009 and 2024, Justice Department and Law Officers Department very roughly have seen something like 20% real terms cuts in their budget. So that is a substantial cut. It's not by any means unusual. It's not the worst of all areas of public services, but that is substantial. And then the flip side of the coin to that is we're really starting to see that, or something else, we're really starting to see those pressures come to bear in the actual outcomes that system is delivering. So take courts, for example. The current backlog in the Crown Court is around 60,000 cases. That's up from around 30,000 cases in 2019, so that's doubled. And even more strikingly, when you start to look at how long people are waiting to get their cases heard, it used to be virtually unheard of that you would wait more than 2 years. Now we've got something like 7,000 cases that are in that bracket, and really just don't, we talk a lot about silence and keeping us guessing. They really don't know when it is that they're going to be able to get that court slot. So that's one part of the system where you can pass as many laws as you like, you can tighten the sanctions however you want. If you don't have the courts functioning to be able to deliver that, there's a real question about how you're actually going to make that change happen. And then let's say that you do get heard, you do get convicted, you go to prison. Well, what happens to you in prison? Since 2009, so since the data started to become available, we've seen that prisons have been operating above their sort of intended capacity, so their sort of normal capacity. They're too full on that measure. But what's changed since then is that there's a sort of secondary measure, which is essentially like a maximum capacity once you start doing things like getting prisoners to share rooms and that kind of thing. So on that maximum capacity measure, we're now at something like 98 or 99% full on our prisons. So really, very genuinely, there's a question if you're going to have loads more prisoners or try and keep people in for longer or try and toughen the sanctions, there's a genuine question about where those people will go if we're not in a world where we're willing or able to actually build more capacity and build more spaces to put them.
And those are just one set of examples. We won't cover every public service, I promise. But another thing I think is very striking is what's happening in local government and the pressures on local government. Again, something like 20% cuts in spending over the last 15 years or so. And again, really big increases on the pressures on spending.
So the cuts in local government, that funding landscape has been really a little bit complicated. But what has absolutely become very clear here is how quickly some of those spending pressures have been rising. So we see, for example, that the number of homeless families living in B&Bs, that's doubled. We talked about that a little bit last week on the podcast. We see pressure in terms of spending on adult social care, in terms of particularly spending on children's social care, both higher numbers of children in need, but also much, much more expensive placements for those children. And what that means is that local government increasingly is delivering specialist services to a small proportion of the population. And we're seeing big cuts in all of the other things that I think sometimes we forget that local government is actually supposed to do as well, because we've got so used to them not being able to. But for example, when we look at youth centres and Sure Start centres, 70% cut since 2010. Highways and transport, 47% cut since 2010.
That's why there's potholes.
I mean, that's a huge part of why there's potholes. It's really hard. And you can go down the list and again, like planning and development, 43% cut. Is it a surprise that we're really struggling to build houses and get planning applications through? Again and again, these services that, we expect our local governments to deliver that form the bedrock of a lot of what we think of as policies that are really necessary for driving to growth, local government almost has been forced to step away from because they're facing a tighter spending situation and they're facing these really big and growing pressures on the things that they statutorily have to provide.
And even in the transport budgets, it's striking what an enormous fraction of that has to go on free transport, free bus passes for older people. This isn't all about potholes, and again, that's why there are so many. Listeners who are interested, we've published a fantastic piece last week on local government funding and a lot of the pressures that Christine has talked about, and indeed a bunch of other services we're not going to cover in this podcast, including higher education and health over the last few weeks, and schools. So do go to our website to have a look at some more of that if you want. But as I promised, we're not going to cover every public service. But what we have there is just a couple of examples of some of the pressures that there are in public services, and one of the reasons why we bang on and on about why it is problematic that neither party is really talking about this baseline and the situation that they're going to inherit and will need to deal with. And we could talk also about public sector pay and some of the pressures there. But Helen, we have been accused of being negative, miserabilist.
You wouldn't think it, would you, listening to us?
You wouldn't, would you? We are such cheerful people. Because the answer to all of this is growth. And it seems that the Labour Party are very confident that they've got the answer to growth. And it's true. If we get a lot more growth, then things do become an enormous amount easier. So perhaps you could just, let's start at the beginning. Why are we? Why should we? Why is it right to focus on growth? Why does it help? What's so great about growth?
So should we try and start really big picture with what we think growth is? So we're talking about the size of the economy, and growth means the economy gets bigger. But the kind of growth we really want is not just that you have more people and we're bigger than Denmark because we have more people. Ideally, what you really want is to get more productive. So however many people you've got, they can produce more things each year. So whether that be, more things you can buy or more services. And that's what ultimately makes us richer because we can, have a nicer life ultimately. So when we're talking about wanting more of that, a bigger economy that was growing more quickly would make it easier for us to deal with things like the debt stock. Maybe we'll come back to that. But in terms of what drives growth, I think that's what's maybe worth talking a little bit about. Because you can imagine having a situation where, investment rose and we had a bigger economy and that would be good. But that's not going to make the economy grow more year and year and year and year and year. What we really want is a high growth rate, meaning the economy keeps getting bigger. And for that, I think you need one of a few things. One thing that can get you that is innovation. So you have a population that's coming up with more ideas. So we're getting better at using our resources, whether it's, our human resources, our talents or our, physical, metals and stuff, to turn stuff and ideas into output. So you can have innovation, or you can have a better allocation of resources. So it could, making sure that our kids get the right skills, they go into the right jobs, people move across the country to where they need to live to get to the best jobs. They move, they're if they want to be self-employed, they're self-employed, but they're not being pushed artificially into doing something that's not best for them. And when people are all, getting the right skills, doing the right jobs, allocating across the economy, and we're being innovative, that's what gets growth ultimately. And if we were doing all of that, it would be easier to pay for public services, to fix our government, to pay down our debts.
Because we'd have more income and we'd be paying more tax. Because if you're growing, you're producing more, you're earning more, you're paying more tax, and therefore you can buy more stuff.
Exactly. And ultimately, everything's better. If you've got more stuff, you can spend, you pay more in tax, but also you can afford to go on nicer holidays, or your living standards are higher. We would, with our labour, we basically, whatever work we did, we'd have a higher return from that. So that's what would make all of these problems easier. We'd find it easier to provide old age care and prison services and everything else. The thing that's difficult about that is it's not just a question of what can we do this year to make the economy bigger. That's kind of an easy question. You can just directly make some investments or do something that makes the economy bigger. It's this kind of need to make sure the economy is growing year on year on year on year. And that requires, as we've said many times, this is where I think we're not pessimistic, and we have said lots of times, we know lots of solutions here. You can make sure the education system is fit for purpose and, as Christine said before, not changing every 2 months, that employers know what kind of skills they're going to get out of people who've come out of education, that our tax system isn't, distorting the allocation of what jobs people choose to do, where they choose to live in the country, that our transport system actually gets people where they need to be and doesn't take, 4 hours to get to work, and so on and so on. All those things, if you do them, can be great because it means that we get this growth rate. But when thinking about the policies we've seen, I guess, the Labour Party policies, I think they have a bunch of policies in there that we would expect to be driving up growth. If you build more houses and, you invest in more innovation and you have better education, that should all bear fruits. But it's not going to bear fruits by Christmas because it's going to need to have more people going through training systems, more people, moving house and getting into new housing, getting new jobs and reallocating. So I think we're optimistic on could we do all of that? Yes, absolutely. I think we know the policy levers you need to move. We know which direction to point the policy levers. The question is, is there going to be the political will to actually do some of this stuff, to actually change planning laws so we can actually build housing, to actually put the money behind infrastructure projects? And then are you willing to wait to see all that stuff feed through the system? You're not going to get it really quickly. So growth is really important. It should absolutely be the laser focus. But you're not going to see it, coming through very quickly.
We might get lucky, of course. I mean, growth isn't just determined by what governments do. It's also determined by the animal spirits in the economy and what goes on in the rest of the world. And I mean, let's hope we do get lucky, but let's focus on what we can actually do. And we won't have a long conversation about planning. It's a slight obsession of mine. And you read day after day after day how our planning decision makers turn down things which are clearly going to be helpful for growth. And there is partly a reason for that, which is that people don't like roads being built through their back gardens or their views spoiled. But if we as a country want to get better off, we're going to have to do something about that. And we obviously need to do more on our transport infrastructure. And it's pretty terrible in some parts of the country. Though, as we've pointed out, both of the main parties are committed to cuts in capital spending, which is going to make transport infrastructure more difficult.
Maybe worth saying just on that, without going into all the details, one of the reasons it's hard, right, is because each of these things in its own right would be a political battle, rightly or wrongly. So planning's probably going to be a political battle. Finding big money for transport shouldn't be difficult, but investment being cut. Tax reform, we know what to do there, but there's lots of vested interest.
Let's talk about this. I mean, we've talked about growth in this podcast relatively recently, but one of the things we didn't really talk about there was this issue of tax reform. I think there's two questions here. I mean, one, I think, is what is it about tax reform that we think could really drive growth? And how depressed are you about the fact that neither of the main parties seem to engage with this at all, despite their apparent view that they want some growth?
We'll start with the easy question. How depressed am I? Very. I need a new job if I'm, rather than another 5 years yodeling into the abyss or whatever I'm supposed to be doing. So on the first, on the growth, again, big picture, what do you need to do on tax? You can either do things where the tax system in various ways discourages people from doing investments. So you can stop that and get more investment. Or the tax system, I'll give you some examples in a minute. The tax system also just leads to resources being allocated badly, and you can stop that, get resources allocated better, and that's what gets you growth. So at high sort of meta level, they're the two kind of things you can be looking to do. So to give you an example, we have capital gains tax rates that are lower than on earned income. And that's often talked about in terms of let's boost entrepreneurship and isn't that all good? But at the same time, the design of the tax base means that we actually discourage investments in lots of cases. A lot of my research recently has been doing lots about this and basically showing that the low rates of capital gains tax are not well targeted at boosting entrepreneurship, even if that's what you want to do. Meanwhile, the tax base is discouraging lots of investment. That's a case where we could redesign the tax system, fix the tax base, get those rates up. It would be better for investment incentives. You would stop people setting up companies, at least in some cases, just for the tax advantages, which can come with some downsides. People would be investing more and be making better choices. Different kind of example altogether with housing. We talk a lot about, building housing and planning, and, that's great. But even whatever housing you've got, given the stock, we have people in the wrong houses because you have a whole bunch of taxes, of which stamp duty is the biggest and most obvious, but there's actually a whole big long list of them that distort where people choose to live for obvious reasons, because it's very expensive to move house because of stamp duty. There might be people who might want to move house, to downsize, to move to a new area, that might make them, more productive, just happier would be good, but just more productive so they can get to a better job, they can take different opportunities, but they don't because of tax. And if you think about one individual doing that, it's like, okay, that's not going to move the dial. But it's all of us. The whole economy is having the same problem. So I think when you add all these things up, tax, it's not the only factor. It's not the only thing you'd want to change. But I think you can look at any tax and there are these kinds of problems with every one of them. And I think if you added them all up, then actually we are doing quite a lot to hold back resources being used in the best way. So I don't think you can just press one button or just fiddle with one tax rate and suddenly, da-da, it's all okay. But I think if we had a concerted effort to have a better tax system, I'm willing to bet real money that it would be better for growth.
Well, we probably shouldn't talk about betting at the moment, but I think it's a very striking example, tax, actually. It is, we know that there are things we need to do to the tax system to improve growth. But there's a whole bunch of things that aren't going to happen because they look politically difficult. We know that getting a closer relationship with the European Union, maybe rejoining the customs union, would be good for growth. But we know that's not going to happen for political reasons. So however much politicians say that they are laser focused on growth, there are still some no-go areas. And I think one of the big challenges for a new government is how far they're willing to stray into what have historically been no-go areas, because, as you say, people will be against it. People don't like new buildings in their areas. But if we want to be better off as a country, we're going to have to grasp that nettle. I've probably mixed an enormous amount of metaphors there, but never mind. So we could talk about. We're not going to go through all of the different ways in which you could get growth going. Those interested can listen to the fantastic conversation I had with Anna Valero on this podcast 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I certainly very much recommend that to anyone who is interested in the whole gamut of things that we could do to get growth going. But Carl, supposing we did get that growth, what sort of let's start with what sort of growth are we currently expecting, and what will be the impact of deviations from that growth level on some of these difficult questions we've been talking about? If we get a little bit more growth, I mean, is everything absolutely hunky-dory? And how much more growth do we need to be able to do all the things that we might want to do?
So the context here is that since 2008, we've had growth which has been absolutely dismal compared to what we would have expected before the financial crisis hit. And actually, a lot of that growth has really come from the population getting bigger, plus our employment rates holding up really quite well, meaning that actually for every hour worked, we're really not getting more productive in the way that we would have expected had we kind of continued to become more productive, more innovative as we did over the decades up to 2008. So the backdrop here is a dismal performance. The official forecasts that Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor, has used to do his tax and spending numbers on is produced by the Office of Budget Responsibility. And essentially what they say is we think going forwards, growth is going to be roughly halfway between the kind of higher level that we enjoyed over several decades up to 2008 and the really dismal growth rates that we've had since 2008. So we're going to pick a number roughly in between the two.
I'm sure they'd say they did it more scientifically than that.
I think it's pretty close to that. Now, there's lots of uncertainty around that. We've already said that, as Helen says, there's lots governments could do that over the longer term could really help boost growth. And Paul, you said, well, actually, there's also lots that could happen that's nothing to do with active decisions by policymakers. I think often our politicians are too quick to claim the glory for growth being great. And obviously they're very quick for understandable reasons to blame others when growth disappoints. But actually, growth is really determined by a whole load of things, much of which is outside of policymakers' hands. So you could just get very lucky. You could have much better growth. We could bounce back to something more like what we enjoyed before the financial crisis. That would add about 0.5 percentage point a year to growth. That would be a big change. I don't think it's very likely, but it's not implausible. And if you get that for 4 years, your economy is going to be bigger. It's going to mean more tax revenues collected. You probably strengthen the public finances around £30 billion a year. That's on the March numbers from the budget, enough to say, actually, we don't need to be cutting investment spending. We don't need to be cutting unprotected public services.
And just to sort of be absolutely clear about that, an extra 0.5% a year on top of current forecasts will basically get us back to something like the kinds of levels of growth we were getting pre-financial crisis.
Yeah, that would be a world where suddenly we wake up and it's like the last 15 years didn't happen. We've worked out how to grow like we always used to grow. So it's not implausible. We had that for many, many decades in a row. It's just not something we've experienced in the last 15 years.
But that really very good outcome, getting back to where we were pre-2008, that's just enough to avoid having to make cuts.
Yeah, I think the public finances would still be a challenge. We'd still barely have debt falling in 5 years' time. We would still have taxes as a share of national income at a high level. But on the kind of scenarios Christine was talking through, you could afford your NHS workforce plan, you could afford some other spending increases in priority areas, and you wouldn't have to be making real terms cuts to those areas that really suffered the brunt of the cuts through the 2010s.
But you wouldn't have lots of money left over for, billions to deal with child poverty or billions to increase the pay of doctors and teachers and civil servants and all those kinds of things.
No, I don't think growth makes all of our trade-offs go away. It makes them just a bit easier. So everything would be a bit easier, but no, you wouldn't be able to say, look, we're going to make massive advances through spending more money in lots of different areas of government.
Let's hope we get that. Let's hope we get something even better. But what if things I hate to say it, like things turn out worse. Is
that pessimism again?
It's that pessimism again. It's realism. It's things do sometimes turn out worse. I mean, who expected COVID and the energy price crisis? I mean, even I wasn't that pessimistic. But it's everything we've said about the toughness facing the choices are based on the OBR's forecasts, which actually. Pretty optimistic. I mean, they're much more optimistic than the Bank of England, for example. So what happens if the OBR suddenly comes over all pessimistic?
And the OBR seems to have a reputation for being pessimistic, but the evidence doesn't really bear that out. Actually, often they've had to downgrade their forecasts since they came into being in 2010. They've often assumed that we will bounce back more quickly than we have done. And you're right, the Bank of England, the other public sector macro forecaster, the one that's responsible for setting monetary policy, interest rates, is much more gloomy. They think that over the next couple of years, the economy is going to grow less quickly, about 0.5 percentage point a year less than what the OBR expects. And if you look at other independent forecasters across the city, yes, there's some that are as optimistic as the OBR, but most are more pessimistic. Most have got a similar view to the Bank of England. And yeah, obviously we've got to hope that whatever happens turns out to be more in line with the OBR or stronger, but we might worry about a world where the Bank of England is right. Were that to happen, you'd be adding about 30 billion a year. If that happened for 4 or 5 years, you'd be adding about 30 billion a year to your fiscal problem. Now, as I say, we might want to hope for the best, but I think it's not unreasonable to ask whoever's Chancellor after the election to not just hope for the best, but have a good plan A, but also have a plan for what you might do if things don't turn out as good as you expect.
And I think therein lies our beef, as it were, with the manifestos of the two main parties. At best, we have a sort of acceptance of the status quo in terms of what might happen to tax and spend over the next few years, but without any sense as to, even under current forecasts, where any cuts might come or what taxes might rise to offset those cuts. But we absolutely don't have any sense of how they would respond to even a modest downgrade in the fiscal forecasts. And I think this is something that I really do think it's incumbent on them to answer, not in the sense of, let's see your detailed spending review and your detailed tax plans for each of the next 5 years. No one sensible wants to see that. But I think it is reasonable to know from the parties that we're voting for an answer to a question of the sort. Suppose growth comes in just a little bit lower than it is expected at the moment. What would you do? Would you raise taxes? Would you actually implement even more spending cuts, or would you change your fiscal rule? Now, to my knowledge, none of them have given anything approaching a straight answer to that question. And actually, I'd like them to go a little bit further. I'd like them to say, well, if I had to raise taxes, this, broadly speaking, is where I'd look. Not I'd put 2.5 pence on income tax, but I might look to income tax, or I might look to capital gains tax, or I might look to corporation tax. And also, if you're going to cut spending, what are the ones you really prioritise on keeping going, and which ones would be first for the chop? Now, again, no detail required, but just some sense of priority. But Christine, that's exactly on the spending side what we're not getting even remotely.
Not even close. And that's particularly the case for the Labour manifesto, but you actually do see it in both Labour and Conservative. So we see both of them have signed up to really big ambitions, really big commitments on the NHS. They want to do this long-term workforce plan, but they also want to meet a whole bunch of targets and aims on A&E and wait times and cancer and a million other things. And they're going to fix dentistry alongside. So really do a whole set of ambitious things. They haven't really told us what the money is. We've talked about the baselines. We don't know what the spending envelope is there. In the Labour Party manifesto, we saw 17 reviews and strategies, at least. There may be more, at least 17 of really big chunky issues like child poverty and homelessness and mental health and pensions and a whole range of other topics. Many of those interrelate. And it's not a silly thing to want to take a step back and say, okay, actually, what do we think about this? What is the plan?
Good. Yeah.
You might think there's something to be said, though, for the idea that, if you're going to do 17 reviews, some of them are going to come in with a pretty chunky price tag. Do we have a sense at all of which ones of those reviews are really the areas that this party would want to focus on, or which ones of them might be left slightly further down the line, might be left for another day when maybe we got a little bit luckier instead?
There is a little bit of cake and eat it here, isn't there? There's a sort of, we're not going to commit money, but we're going to make out everything as a priority, and we're going to have a strategy for everything and try and sort out everything.
Except the tax system.
Except the tax system, you're right there.
And I think my challenge with this a little bit is, it's been put to us that manifestos are about vision and they really shouldn't be getting bogged down in the specifics here. And that's fine. I can understand the political economy point there. But as a voter, what I want to know is what's the realistic vision to be delivered here? Because if you don't have that constraint of realism of what happens if things actually aren't as good as you hoped that they would be, then what's to stop anybody from setting out a vision that says, I'm going to have the most amazing public services, we're going to be world-beating on growth, we're going to have the best tax system that raises no money from anybody who might remotely have a vote, and we're going to have debt falling, and everyone is going to want to lend to us. And by the way, I mean, who wouldn't vote for that? I would vote for that. Sign me up. I'm right there. But, to some extent, people say to govern is to choose. And when you choose, you have to either wrestle with, here is what I want to make happen, and here is why it hasn't happened before, and I understand that, and I'm going to change that. Or here is what I want to make happen, and someone is not going to like that. And I am going to make a choice to go ahead with that strategy anyway, because that's my priority. And that was, I think, the thing that was entirely missing.
It's not, just stepping back. I mean, I think people assume that voters we can't tell them about all of this. It's like, you pretend everything's okay. But of course, governments have been making choices, right? You read off that list of local government. They have chosen how much to cut out of the different local government budgets. Choices have been made. I reckon actually voters would quite like to know about these things and help make that choice about, do you want to prioritise adult and child social care, or transport budgets, or planning applications, or courts, or these are the kinds of things. And what does the state do that we should absolutely be talking about and making choices about? We can't do everything. What do we prioritise? So I think this idea that voters don't, we can't, but we pretend like it's not there. Like, well, it is there, and we will make choices, just not ones that have been well informed by voters knowing what they're voting for. That just seems not a good idea at all.
Well, we should probably finish there, but perhaps I'll finish with a quote which might resonate with the Labour Party, who look like they're likely to win this election, which is a famous quote from Aneurin Bevan, who said that the language of priorities is the religion of socialism, which is something that the Labour Party might want to take on board and actually speak the language of priorities to us, the voters, so that we know what religion it is we might be voting for. So, thank you, Carl. Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Christine. And thank you, everyone, for listening, as we have expressed a degree of frustration, I think it would be fair to say, at some of what we, the IFS, and what you as voters are being told and not being told by the political parties. We will probably be back with another one of these pre-election podcasts in the next several days, but we will certainly be back post-election and in the run-up to what we expect to be another fiscal event in the autumn, where we might begin to get the answers to some of these questions. So even after the election, it's all still going to be very exciting. So thank you for listening to this special episode of the IFS Zooms In. To see more of our work, do visit us at www.ifs.org.uk. And to further support us, please do consider becoming a member for as little as £10 a month. You can find out more in the episode description. We'll see you next time.